welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad that you're here for episode 40 of the show. This week's game was honestly pretty intimidating to me once I got into it, but I'm super excited to share my thoughts with you. Before we dive right in, let's take a moment to touch on reviews and news. This week, the podcast got one new 5-star review on iTunes. The unfortunate thing is that I can't see who gave me the review unless they write a comment on it. So if I'm missing some sort of obvious iTunes feature that addresses this, please let me know because I would love to give this person a shout out. For now though, you know who you are and I want to say thank you. In news this week, Microsoft and Sony got in bed together. What? GameSpot's subtitle to their recent article about this was perfect because it says, "Nobody expected that." Damn straight. From what the public have seen, Microsoft and Sony have been tolerating each other at best. So what are they actually collaborating on? The partnership these companies are entering into specifically has to do with cloud solutions within Microsoft Azure. Sony's president Yoshida said, "For many years, Microsoft has been a key business partner for us, though of course the two companies have also been competing in some areas. I believe that our joint development of future cloud solutions will contribute greatly to the advancement of interactive content." In turn, Microsoft's CEO Nadella said, "Sony has always been a leader in both entertainment and technology, and the collaboration we announced today builds on this history of innovation. Our partnership brings the power of Azure and Azure AI to Sony to deliver new gaming and entertainment experiences for customers." There's been a lot of speculation that this partnership was partly formed in order to combat Google's Stadia project, but honestly, whatever the case, it's going to be super cool to see what comes out of this. These are two giant companies that have a huge stake in the gaming space. I have no doubt that we're going to get something awesome from this partnership. Let's move on now to this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about Ash of Gods Redemption, which is part role-playing visual novel and part turn-based strategy game. It was released on March 23rd of 2018 and was developed by Aram Dust. From what I can tell, Aram Dust was founded on May 17th of 2016 by Nikolay Bondarenko. I will butcher every single name in this episode. And Ash of Gods is their first game as a studio. They have a small office in Moscow, but a lot of the team actually works remotely from different locations. Ash of Gods is currently just available on PC, Mac, and Linux, but the studio has plans to bring it to consoles as well. According to HowLongToBeat.com, this game takes around 23 hours for the main campaign and upwards of 35 hours for a completionist. It's also important to note that it has multiplayer on top of the single-player campaign. Let's talk now about the narrative. What do a magician, hitman, and retired soldier have in common? Although each of them sees the world in an entirely different light, they all feel the coming of the reaping. A darkness hangs in the air. Rumors of dark magic float from town to town, and blood can be seen running down city streets. In Terminus, no one is safe. If you run, the curse will find you, and if you fight, you're better off dead. Who will be taken, and how many will fall before the reaping's thirst is quenched? Nobody knows, and that's what's especially frightening. Ash of Gods is set in the medieval land of Terminus. From the moment you start this game, you find yourself in a world clearly inspired by series like The Witcher and Lord of the Rings. People fight with swords and spears, and although magic isn't common practice, it's very alive and well. At least in the first 6 hours of the game, the narrative follows 3 separate stories. You jump from character to character, slowly learning about their background and what role they play as the reaping has returned. I'm assuming that as I play further into the game, their paths will eventually cross, but that hasn't happened to me yet. I've mentioned the reaping a couple times now, but what exactly is it? I'll be completely honest, it's still pretty vague in my mind, but I'll tell you what I've gleaned so far. The reaping is bad. It's been a long time since the last reaping. Somehow a race of immortals are involved. The reaping first became apparent when people started finding a curse on their necks, and a gray, scary-looking bunch of dudes called the Reapers have taken to killing anyone who crosses their path. Needless to say, you start off the game in a world that is panicked and chaotic. Yet, the first character we'll touch on is someone who finds his own inner peace in the midst of the craziness taking place around him. That character is Lo Feng. Lo is an icon from the Clan of Shadows. He's an insanely dangerous assassin who's currently working as a bodyguard for Pelko Saturi. Although his job is to protect Pelko, Lo's true loyalty is to his people, his clan, and himself. He's quiet and reserved, believing that weakness is shown through emotions and speech. That's part of what makes Lo Feng so deadly. The second main character you follow is Thorn Brennan. Thorn is an honest warrior. He's a father to his daughter, a husband to his wife, and an honorable veteran who continues to train younger men in the ways of combat. He's the type of guy you want as your friend. Someone who is loyal, trustworthy, and strong. That being said, Thorn is fighting his own personal battles as well, trying to support his wife who has a weak heart, and attempting to raise a daughter to be someone of character. The third individual you play as is Hopper Ruley. Hopper has a calm demeanor, and he's not afraid of difficult times. He's not tied down to any place or people. Instead, he seeks to learn. Anyone who's met Hopper can quickly see the wisdom and experience that lies behind his eyes. It's hard to know exactly how old he is, but his knowledge seems more expansive than that which can be gained in a single lifetime. Since this is a much larger game than we usually look at, I want to focus on the broad narrative strokes. What are some of the strengths and weaknesses that we can see in the story? The first strength is that the world is expansive and interesting. Sure, there are plenty of character and world tropes, but this wasn't a story that was thrown together overnight. Remember how this is partly a visual novel? Although turn-based battles are core to the game, I still spent more time conversing with characters around the campfire and talking with people while traveling. Most conversations can be cut short if you choose to do so, but there's a whole pile of conversations to dive into and lore to uncover if you so choose. There's a sense of deep complexity to the narrative, which is aided and enhanced by the second strength, player agency. On the Ash of Gods website, it actually describes the storytelling as roguelike. Basically what's meant by that is that your decisions, when it comes to conversations, can drastically change the state of the game and story. Main characters can die, characters can be weakened, loyalties can be broken, and so on. One small example of this taking place was with Lo Feng. Early on, you can choose whether or not to execute a specific character. The first time I chose, I decided that I wasn't going to execute her. After I made that choice, I ended up in a battle against, I think, around 7 guards and a very scary boss. I ended up having to close the game during the middle of that, and unfortunately there hadn't been a quick save yet, so I played out the situation again. That time though, I decided to execute the girl. I wanted to see what changed if I did that. After doing so, I still had a battle, but the boss wasn't there. I hadn't played out the first situation through to the end, so I didn't know if the lady I didn't execute would have joined my party, but it was still cool seeing the game behave differently based on the choices I made. This actually brings us to our first narrative weakness. The game doesn't inform your decisions sufficiently. When I chose not to execute the girl for the first time, I was role-playing my character, but I had no knowledge of what my choice would impact. The second time, I honestly thought something would happen to keep me from killing her. It didn't. Although I don't think it would be good for the game to spell out exactly what each decision would do down the line, it would be nice at least to have a bit more context for each choice. It could be as simple as adding some subtext to those decisions which are crucial to the story. Yeah, that might hurt immersion slightly, but it really sucks to make decisions that affect something in a way that you really don't want. The second narrative weakness that stood out to me is that the story is too complex for its own good. This might seem like a direct contradiction to the first strength I mentioned, but it's not as though the story isn't interesting. The issue for me was that it felt like I was flying down the track of a roller coaster without being strapped in. By the time I would get used to the whole troop of characters in Thorn's party, I would get thrown over to Lo Fang's story, and by the time I was invested in his story, I would get thrown over to Hopper's adventure. This may have been okay if the backstories and companions were simple, but there was just too much shit to try and follow. There seemed to be a lot of awesome lore in the game to uncover, but it got to a point where I cared very little about the narrative since I had no way to follow everything that was happening. The writing was decent and the story was interesting, there just needed to be a better on-ramping to all of that complexity. Let's move on now to gameplay. Turn-based strategy. If you're anything like me, those words spark excitement. I've talked about XCOM 2 way too much for an indie game show, but that's one of my favorite titles of all time. There's something so cool about having a genre of video games that's basically board games come to life. So, how well does Ash of God's Redemption represent that genre? Overall, quite well. Before we jump right in though, let me mention a couple of quick things. First off, make sure you remember that I've only made it 6 hours into this game. If things change dramatically at hour 10 or hour 20, I'm unaware. My assumption though is that things will remain relatively unchanged throughout the experience. Second, I've heard from multiple sources that there's a lot of similarities between this game and Banner Saga, and although that might be the case, I've personally never played Banner Saga, so if you think I'm missing an obvious comparison, that's why I'm not bringing it up. Alright, so you're riding along the road when all of a sudden you're ambushed by a group of bandits. What happens then? Well, obviously fighting without a grid on the ground is completely ridiculous, so a grid magically appears. You pick which party members should go into battle, you equip them with trinkets, and then you place them on the field. The battle now begins. Although I brought up XCOM earlier, this game actually has way more similarities to a game like chess. In XCOM, you get to move all your characters in a turn, and then the enemy gets to move all their characters in a turn. In Ash of Gods, you move one character and use an action if applicable, and then an enemy moves a character, and then you move a character, and then an enemy moves a character, and so on. Also, once you use a character, you can't use that specific person again until all of your other characters have been moved. Both of these things lead to a much more methodical battle system. It also made mistakes hurt a lot more. In XCOM, assuming that you don't just go back to a previous save, if you make a crappy move, you can usually make up for it by positioning the rest of your squad accordingly. In Ash of Gods, if you move a character into a dangerous spot, that's it. They are f***ed. One movement system isn't necessarily better or worse than the other. It's just that the one in Ash of Gods had an entirely different feel from what I was expecting. Another unique mechanic I want to touch on has to do with health and energy. These are the two primary resources you get to manage. Not only can you use health and energy to pay for specific abilities, they also can be specifically targeted when you attack. For example, if I want my archer to attack, when I click an enemy, I have to decide whether I want to deal damage to their energy or to their health. Obviously, if I deal damage to their health, they will be closer to dying. However, if I deal damage to their energy, they may not be able to perform certain attacks on their turn, and more importantly, if their energy is depleted, they will take an amplified amount of damage to their health bar. Although the whole health and energy system is relatively simple, it led to some very interesting strategies. So what are the main strengths and weaknesses of combat in Ash of Gods? The first strength is that the depth of strategy was fun and rewarding. It doesn't reinvent the turn-based strategy wheel, but battles were a real challenge. Unlike XCOM, there are no dice rolls in this game. For you, that could either be a positive or a negative, but the point is that every move you make is important. You're not going to have that 5% execute chance like you have in XCOM. You either play the match correctly or you lose. The second strength is that there was a nice variety of classes, and although the abilities are pretty limited early on, there are plenty of upgrades and additional moves that are unlocked as your character levels up. There are guardians, archers, wizards, assassins, monks, and so on. The one thing I will say though is that when you start out as Thorn and his crew, they are all pretty low power in the beginning, but when you jump over to Lo Fang's journey, he is insanely strong. It matched up thematically, but it made me enjoy my time with Thorn and his squad a lot less after playing someone so much better. In terms of combat weaknesses, the main one I see is in regards to turn order. Because the game doesn't allow you to move your character again until all of its teammates have gone, it has a side effect of making larger parties weaker. Let's pretend you have one super strong character. If you choose to bring 3 total people into battle, you only have to wait for 2 other characters to move before your powerful character can strike again. If you choose to bring 5 total people into battle, you literally double the time it takes to use your star character. Sure, you could make the argument that choosing your squad size is part of the strategy, but who doesn't want to take as many people into battle as possible? That's a dumb decision to have to make. I'm not certain what the best fix would be, but possibly implementing some sort of speed system would have been better. Although I could nitpick a lot of other small things, I think that the combat provided a great experience overall. We could also talk on and on about some of the other minor systems in Ash of Gods, but for the sake of not weighing the showdown with less important gameplay elements, let's move on now to discuss the art and sound design. Both the sound design and art in Ash of Gods are incredibly strong. The soundtrack was a result of a collaboration between Adam Screwup, Christoph, oh, holy hell, Viersen Kizvix, and Michael Silecki. Oh my gosh. Those I'm just not going to try and pronounce Russian names from now on. If you're not familiar with their names, which is probably because I pronounce them terribly, these guys wrote music for some big games like The Witcher, Bulletstorm, Call of Juarez, EVE Online, and so on. The music fit well in the game. It gave scope and depth to an already vast world, and it did so without overwhelming the minute-by-minute gameplay. One other really cool thing about the music is that they used a lot of authentic medieval instruments in the songs themselves. When it comes to the art, it was a more illustrative style. On the Ash of Gods website, they cite old-school Disney cartoons and the Soviet animation studio, Soyuz Multifilm, as inspirations for the visuals. The hand-drawn art is just gorgeous to look at, and it gives the game such a unique look. I know my screenshot habits aren't proof of the quality of art in games, but I do gauge how much I like the look of a game by how many screenshots I take. This game took me back to a lot of old-school animated movies, and I found myself taking screenshot upon screenshot. Let's take a moment now to summarize the positives and negatives of Ash of Gods Redemption. First off, on the positive side, the depth of narrative and lore was impressive. The author of the script, Sergei Malitsky, is a contemporary Russian fantasy author and his experience shines through in the writing. It was also super fun having so much agency over how the story played out. Second, the turn-based battles were exhilarating. Enemies are not easy to take down in this game, so every move you make feels important. The more I learn about combos and synergies in battle, the more I find myself enjoying the structure. Third, the art and sound design round out the game well. This game is beautiful to look at and listen to, and both of those elements help to pull you into the world of Terminus in a meaningful way. First off, on the negative side, the depth of narrative backfired due to the structure of storytelling. I was quickly overwhelmed by the places and the terms and the choices and the characters, and I just couldn't keep up in a meaningful way. The game didn't give me time to breathe and absorb what I was learning, and as a result, it turned me off to the whole narrative experience. Second, the turn structure of battle was suboptimal. I really disliked that your party's size directly limited the amount of actions a character could take over the course of a battle. There really needed to be some sort of speed system involved if they wanted to keep that kind of structure. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My consensus is to farm up and wait for Ash of Gods to go on sale. This game feels quite a bit like Book of Demons in the sense that there are some great elements to the game, but there are also some glaring issues. This isn't a must-play by any means, but if it goes on sale one day and this world and genre is appealing to you, go pick it up. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in. If you enjoy what you hear, if you enjoy the show and the reviews I do, don't forget to go over to iTunes to give the show a 5-star review, and then tell me about it. You can reach me at klutchkittengaming@gmail.com or on Instagram at klutchkittengaming. You can ask me a question, give me a dare, say something nice, or tell me about how my pronunciation of Russian names is terrible. I hope you have an amazing rest of the day, and I'll see you in game.